This is sound roll number 14, wild sound effects for leaving the docks and heading out into the channel.
That voice you just heard belongs to David, the one with the beard and the stubborn look in his eye. He's my sound man. And that's me, Bart. We're making a film, and it's called Take Two from the Sea.
It all began back in Hollywood. The biggies at Universal Studios wanted to talk to Bart and me about making a movie. Since they refused to discuss the project over the phone, we could only assume that it was big, really big. Bart politely asked me to wait outside while he clinched the deal. He claimed that I looked unprofessional and potentially shifty. Bart has such a nice way of putting things. Hollywood isn't a bad place to be. You can always find a familiar face. When Bart walked outside, I knew instantly that the project was something beyond our wildest imaginations. And it was. Our assignment?
Clams and oysters. At least they gave us a big fancy camera van to travel around in. Since we knew nothing about clams and even less about oysters, we had no idea where to look for them. With a little research, we discovered that clams and oysters are found wherever salt and fresh water mix, in bays and estuaries on all coasts of the United States. So we started our search up the West Coast.
Hey, Bart.
Yeah?
Have you ever thought of the possible number of other things we could be making this film about?
We're not getting money to shoot other things.
High wire acts, lady wrestlers.
Well, yeah, I thought about it, you know, but we got paid to make this film.
Okay, well, I want you to know, really, that the only reason I'm doing this is for the money.
David, I had no illusions about why you're in this film. I thought maybe our friendship might enter into it, our partnership.
Movies move. Clams and oysters don't move. They lay right on the bottom. They don't move from the time they're born.
You know something, David? You will pay for this abuse. You'll pay.
As long as I don't have to eat any oysters, Bart.
You will be up to your neck in oysters. Right up to the neck, David.
Well, Bart was right about that. We really got into it. At least Bart did. There were so many oysters on the flats that you could hardly move without stepping on them. But just as I predicted, the oysters were just lying there.
Walking around on those flats was kind of rough. But the same oysters I was stepping over that morning turned out to be a lot easier to harvest later that day, at high tide.
What kind of oysters can we find on the West Coast?
Well, on the West Coast we have both the Olympias and the Pacific oysters. The Olympia oyster is an oyster native to this country, originating way back in the beginning of time. Our Pacific oyster is an oyster that was first brought into our country in the early 20s of a Japanese origin. This dredge that we're going out to now is a dredge that is harvesting Pacific oysters.
Pacific oysters.
Right.
Can you give me an idea how the dredge works, how it actually functions to get the oysters?
Well, it actually acts like a big vacuum sweeper. It just lifts the oysters up off the bottom onto a conveyor belt. The conveyor brings them on up to the surface, transferring them to a barge. We can harvest with the two men approximately 1,000 bushel an hour in a well-planted bed.
That sounds like a lot of oysters, and it is. But that was Pacific oysters.
Next we saw Olympia oysters, which are much smaller. They're considered quite a delicacy. Shucking them is easy, when you know how. Olympia oysters are usually grown in oyster dikes, which are nothing but big, man-made tide pools.
What do the dikes do?
Well, the dikes provide protection from the extremes of heat and cold, like a cushion of protection of water at low tide.
See.
Further up the coast, we found another way to farm oysters, raft culture. In this method, they grow oysters on strings, which are hung from rafts. Because the oysters are stacked on top of each other, like apartments in a high-rise building, you can grow a lot more oysters in a smaller area. And because the oysters are floating in the plankton zone, they get more food. This makes them grow faster and larger.
Even the son of an oyster farmer has to work up his courage before he can down his first raw oyster. That confirmed all my suspicions. Having learned all we could about West Coast oysters, we set out to investigate clams the next day. Bart figured he could do his preliminary research best from the back of a speedboat.
We finally located some clams on a nearby beach. I figured I could learn the most about West Coast clams from a man who really knows what clams are all about. Clams look different from oysters, but they're both bivalve shellfish. The generic name for them is mollusk.
This looks like a good spot. We'll try right here for some of our clams.
What's the green stuff?
That's eel grass that I'm shoveling off. I can get down to where the clams are in this gravel. We've got butter clams, little necks, hard shells. Today we have about a -1 foot tide.
Well, what's this?
Oh, that's a cockle. Now, those are good eating. All the clams are very excellent eating, but a cockle is a little bit strong, so we always use that in chowder. We run it through a meat grinder and make it into chowder. That's a little neck. That's a good one. Here's another one. That's a butter clam there. That's a good steamer. Well, here's another larger butter clam. We'll use that for clam chowder.
Do clams make pearls, too?
Well, they make a pearl, but it's a very irregular pearl and not good in color. You have to have an oyster to make a real pearl that you can sell on the market. Yeah. Save that one. That'll make a good eating. We just got about enough in the bucket there for a good mess for you and I.
Those clams were really terrific. Digging your own makes them taste even better. But there's more than one way to get a clam. People who harvest clams for a living use more efficient methods. Like the oyster dredge we saw earlier, this clam dredge uses jets of water to stir up the bottom and lift the clams onto a conveyor belt.
When I heard about this process, I was skeptical, but it turns out the dredges don't hurt the bottom.
They find all sorts of clams on the West Coast. Gaper clams, cockles, razor clams, butter clams, and geoducks. Geoducks are the largest and one of the most popular West Coast clams. Since they sort the clams by size, the men have to make several decisions a second.
The next day, we shipped all our exposed film back to Hollywood, said a little prayer, and headed across the Rockies to our next location, the Gulf Coast.
The first thing we had to get used to on the Gulf Coast was the pace of life down here. Oysters are the big thing on the Gulf Coast. David was still curious about why people go for oysters, so he decided to find out for himself.
Don't look at that camera.
Yeah.
You like oysters?
Yeah. Love them. Love oysters.
You like big oysters or small oysters?
Any kind.
Fried? Any way that
Raw.
you prefer?
Very raw.
Preferred.
Yeah.
Do you like oysters?
I love oysters, certainly.
What do you like about
I
them?
just love, oh, the freshness when they're nice and salty, especially, that's when they're the best.
What kind of oysters do you like?
All kinds.
I mean, you even like them raw?
Right,
You like raw oysters?
right.
I eat oysters.
Do you like them?
Yeah,
How come?
because they taste good.
Well, my father forced me to eat them.
Your father forced you to eat them?
Well, yeah, he said that, they really are good and you ought to try them. I didn't want to, so he said, try it. So I said, okay, and I really liked them then.
What about when you eat oysters? How many oysters do you eat at one time?
About at least a dozen.
Probably the most we ever had was about 10 dozen.
10 dozen?
Yeah.
You sat down and ate 10 dozen oysters at one time?
At one time, I could eat 3,
3? I just talked to a man that could eat 6 dozen.
6 dozen.
6 dozen. And then you can walk around ripping doors off and stuff like that after you eat that many oysters?
It all depends on the individual.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You know, is that true? I mean, you know, what's all this talk about oysters?
Well, oysters, they believe oysters has a tendency to build within themselves, you know.
Build what?
Build their nature up.
Let's get more specific. What nature? Mother Nature?
Mother Nature.
You mean it's make you stronger man?
Right.
I don't believe that. You know, I mean, I've heard the same thing 100 times, but I don't believe it's true.
Do you like oysters?
Yeah, I like oysters.
How come?
Because
They're good to eat. They're tasty.
if you don't like them, you don't like them. And if you'll get used to them, probably.
I don't think you can get used to an oyster. You either like it after you've tried it, or you don't.
I don't know, I got used to them. They're okay now.
I think they were good.
Oh, yeah, I love the taste. They're really good.
They taste very good. I just love them.
I like them.
The last person we interviewed turned out to be something of an expert. She said that if we really wanted to find out what oysters are all about, we'd have to try them ourselves. David had certain reservations.
Sure, I had reservations. There's an old saying, he who ate the first raw oyster was a brave man. And I am not a brave man. Jean was a walking oyster encyclopedia, and Bart was really soaking it up.
It was nice to meet a girl who was so well-informed. Oysters, it turns out, are a very healthy food. She told us that they're high in protein and low in calories. They're in a class with milk. A half dozen oysters on the half shell, for example, contain only about 70 calories. Both oysters and clams give you a good supply of iron and vitamins. Oysters are full of all sorts of goodies that the body needs that you don't get from most other foods.
Funny, I never knew Bart was so interested in nutrition.
And the great thing about it all is that there are so many ways to prepare them.
Meanwhile, the moment of truth had arrived for me.
For some people, oysters take a little getting used to. Fortunately, David's uncouth reaction didn't keep Jean and me from enjoying a terrific dinner.
The next day, Bart planned to shoot a local oyster boat, and we headed out into the bayou country.
Hey, Bart, this is at least the 10th time we've been over this bridge.
Sure, it's a pretty bridge, isn't it, Dave?
Look, I think it's a good idea to go out and shoot a clam barge. I think it's really a fine thing for this film. At the same time, I think it would be nice if we knew where we were going.
Follow the water.
There's water here, there's water over there, there's water all over this place. Haven't you been looking around?
Instead of tall stand of trees, next to a sign for watch it, next to a sign.
Why don't you look at your map there? Find it on the map. Come on, give me a break.
The map's not going to help us. And it's not a clam boat, Dave. It's an oyster barge. There are no
Look
clam...
over there. This guy, he'll
Just
help.
keep driving, please. Trust me. I will get you there.
How he got us there is another story. It was hotter than a steamed clam, so Bart rented a portable fan. We do everything first class.
Young oysters are harvested so they can be transplanted in a less crowded bed, where they'll grow better. Gulf Coast oysters are the same type as East Coast oysters. But since the water is warmer in the Gulf, the oysters mature in 2 years instead of 3. Normally, oysters grow about an inch a year. Because the water is low in salt, the clams and oysters here taste sweeter, less salty.
That makes sense. At first, Bart told me there were no clams down here, but he was wrong again. On the eastern part of the Gulf, they scoop up Venus sunray clams.
While we were shooting, David started picking up a strange sound on his earphones. At first, Dave thought it was another airboat, but it turned out to be a state inspector flying in to check the dredging operation. In every state where clams and oysters are harvested, there's a government organization that regulates the industry.
inspection.
Like a lot of the other oyster men around here, the skipper is of Slavonian descent.
How's your oysters running?
Kind of skinny, Max.
Going to be bedding from the natural seed ground when it opens up?
Yeah, we're going to bed a few for 1 month.
These inspectors do a lot to help the oystermen. They control the harvest to prevent depletion of the oyster beds. They inspect the waters where shellfish grow to make sure that it's clean. And they supervise the planting of oyster shells on which young oysters grow. We found out how that was done.
Several times a year, barges loaded with several tons of empty oyster shells are towed out to the bays, and the shells are scattered overboard. There's a method to this madness. Young oyster larvae are swimming around in the water, and they need something to latch onto in order to grow. The empty shells, called culch, provide the best home for the young oysters. If we didn't give oysters this helping hand, they'd probably have an even tougher time surviving.
Sailing back to port, I began to realize how many people go to a lot of trouble to make sure that oysters survive. I guess they must be worth it. Maybe I really hadn't given them a chance.
That evening, we headed up to the East Coast, where people have been eating clams and oysters for hundreds of years.
One of the oldest ways to gather clams is by raking for them in shallow water. But finding a clam raker wasn't as easy as we expected.
Who said it was going to be easy?
I think there's got to be another way to get out here, Bart.
No, I think this is it. I couldn't find any other way.
Does the guy get out here this way?
Yeah, the same way. If I could
No, he didn't come out this way. He does this every day?
A little further and we'll find him. We'll find him.
All right.
Up. All right.
Bart!
Don't hang on to me.
Okay, let's try to play this straight now.
Try to play it straight. I play it just fine. Hi, how you doing? My name's Bart, and this is David.
Hi.
And, well, what we're doing is we're making a film about clams and oysters. If you wouldn't mind, we'd just like to take some footage of what you're doing. Is that okay?
Go ahead. Right ahead.
Well, that's great. Ready, Dave?
Sure.
Turn it on, Dave.
Okay, boss.
Some say the early settlers stayed close to the coast because they depended on clams and oysters to keep them alive during the long, hard winters. Standing there in our present condition, the icy waters swirling about our knees, it was easy to imagine what those winters must have been like.
So we vowed that from now on we would film clams under drier circumstances. The driest boat we could find was the soft clam dredge. Most soft clams are taken in northern New England in the Chesapeake Bay. Some people call them steamers. Soft clams are easy to spot because their necks stick out beyond their shells. Riding up the East Coast, we ran across another dredge. This one was harvesting hard clams. Since they get clams of all sizes out here, they are sorted by size as they come up out of the water.
Later on that day, we found out more about the different sizes of clams and what they're used for. The nice thing about digging your own clams is that you really work up an appetite that way. So they tell me.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing. Hello, hello. Hi, how you doing?
Hi.
Listen, you're not going to believe this, but we're taking some pictures, and we'd like to take some pictures of you and talk to you. Is that all right?
Yes.
It is?
Yes.
Great. Well, here's what we'll do. How about if you look right over there at that guy? If you look at him, he won't bite. You all set, Bart?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go.
Along the edge of the shore here, I believe there'd probably be a lot of different kinds of clams, right?
Yes, there's quite a few different kinds.
You want to tell me what they are?
Yes. You can find a little neck.
That's this one?
A small one, yes. Then the cherry stone, the next in size.
All right.
And the chowder clam.
Chowder clam's a big guy,
The
huh?
larger one, yes.
If people are going to eat this little tiny one, this little neck, how would they eat it?
Raw.
And how about this one you call the cherry stone?
Raw and steamed.
And this one?
In chowder.
The big one's a chowder clam.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, cut.
By this time, I thought I'd seen every kind of clam there was, but there turned out to be yet another kind, the surf clam.
Using electronic depth recorders to find them, this surf clam dredge can scoop up clams when the ocean is 200 feet deep. Operating 30 miles off the Atlantic coast, this area is noted for its waves, called slow rollers. It takes about 20 minutes to fill the dredge, and in the meantime, there's nothing to do but lie around and try not to think about the slow rollers.
These were the biggest clams we'd seen yet. They must use them for chowder.
For once, David was right. They do use them to make chowder and minced clams.
People have been studying clams and oysters for a long time, but as we found out at a marine laboratory, there's always a lot more to learn.
What kind of work are you doing?
Bart, we're studying reproduction of oysters in the laboratory.
Reproduction? Then you have different sexes in here.
Yes, there are male and female oysters in this tank. In the spring of the year, the female release their eggs into the water, and the male release their sperms, and fertilization occurs.
What's the movement I see in there?
Well, what you've probably seen are larval oysters that have arrived on the shell after several weeks of development through larval stages in the water, and we refer to them as spat.
Well, what happens to them? Do they all grow up?
Oh, no. Very few of those will survive. As a matter of fact, only 2 or 3 of them will actually develop into a full-grown oyster on that shell.
Well, how do you tell the difference between males and females?
Telling a male from a female oyster is a very difficult thing to do. As a matter of fact, an individual oyster, such as any one of these, could change its sex several times in its lifetime.
Change?
An oyster's lot is not a happy one. Besides the problems of changing its sex from time to time, an oyster has several natural enemies. Starfish can wipe out hundreds of acres of clams and oysters. The starfish just pry open the shell and suck out the clams and oysters.
The drill, as you might have guessed, actually drills a hole in the shell to get at its victim. It figures that these predators must be very fond of clams and oysters, since they go to such lengths to get them.
With all these predators, oysters need help to survive. Hatcheries are designed to do just that. The hatcheries do something they call aquaculture, which is a $3 word for oyster farming. What they do is experiment to find new ways to grow oysters, like growing them on plastic sheets. Once the oysters are old enough to fend for themselves, they are planted in oyster beds. A few months ago, I would have been surprised to see that they still use sailboats to get oysters, but nothing surprises me anymore. Bart said that I was going to be up to my neck in clams and oysters, and he was right. When we got back to Hollywood, Bart hit on the terrific idea of having a clam bake, kind of a promotional gig for the film. We needed to pick up a few things at the supermarket. I had no idea you could just go to the market and get clams and oysters. It's amazing what a variety of forms they come in.
Yeah, and they're so easy to fix, even David can do it.
With all the new methods of packaging clams and oysters, you can buy them any month of the year. There's an old myth that you shouldn't eat oysters in a month that has an R in it, but that's not true anymore.
In cans, you can get steamed clams, oyster bisque, oyster stew, New England clam chowder, and Manhattan clam chowder.
Frozen, you can get breaded clams, breaded oysters, oysters Mornay, oysters Rockefeller, and clams Casino.
And of course, you can get them fresh at the seafood counter. Fresh oysters and fresh clams. There, that should just about do it.
When we finished the film, the big shots at the studio were very happy with it. They called us back because they had an even bigger project for us to tackle. I knew that this time it was something big. Really big, like, well, like...
whales.